Hello and welcome to today's webinar to discuss the Bev50 Sports and Energy Drinks Deep Dive. This recently released report was produced by Alpha Diver in partnership with Beverage Digest. My name is Dwayne Stanford, editor and publisher of Beverage Digest, which serves the industry's top executives with a carefully curated subscription newsletter, brand-level sales reference data, and an annual Future Smarts industry conference taking place in New York City on December 11th. Visit beveragedigest.com for details on how to access all that market intelligence. Now, speaking of Future Smarts, we were pleased to welcome Alpha Diver to our stage last year to discuss their innovative work to help brands discover the truth behind consumer behavior. From there, we collaborated on the Bev50 Psych Pulse report released this summer. That's available on both of our websites. Alpha Diver has since taken a deep dive into the sports and energy drink segment of that research. Now, with me today is the founder of Alpha Diver, Hunter Thurman. Hunter's vision for Alpha Diver was to apply behavioral science to understand marketplace behavior. He gathered leading minds in the worlds of neuroscience and psychology and quickly discovered the wealth of insight that was sitting untapped within academia. As he describes it, Hunter's team built the framework of durable, predictable human truth, specifically the 4 drivers and 5 barriers that underlie behavior. Hunter's team works with leading brands and Wall Street analysts and the Wall Street analyst community to continually explain, measure, and predict consumer behavior. Today, Hunter will present his team's findings, and then he'll join me for a follow-up Q&A. Please use the Q&A tab found in the Zoom interface, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. The slides and recording of today's presentation will be available to registrants later. So with that, I'd like to welcome Hunter Thurman.
Thanks, Dwayne. Great to be here. I'm going to set up my slides here, and I appreciate the intro. You've got such a great radio voice. I always feel it's a tough act to follow. But yeah, so we've really enjoyed the collaboration. As you said, we've got a lot of data here from the beverage category, but we've also studied other categories, and even the things we're going to talk about today really transcend even beyond beverage. So what we're measuring is basically 3 things. So we as you know, we collaborated to put this list together, looking at in the Bev50 the top 50 more or less volume brands. But we put in some other ones that were just interesting to us, or that have been making waves, or you guys have been following and covering. But instead of looking at just, backward looking sales, things like that, we measured these psychological factors. So we're looking at behavior, what our psychology team calls routinization, like how every day is this for people, how enthusiastic are they, and what's the momentum of it. And so you see our principal researcher, Siggy Hale, who is a PhD neuroscientist, and really the architect of this measure. But essentially what we're doing is understanding the whys, people's psychology. And we talked about that a lot in the Bev50. And as we continue to collaborate on this and look at some of these things, what's growing, what's declining, why, how every day, as I said, are these, and how emotionally attached are people, how successful are these brands in imprinting in people's minds. We really wanted to dig deep into sports and energy. And in doing so, we assess, as you said, these we sometimes call them the 9 whys, the 4 drivers and the 5 barriers. Today, I'm going to focus on the drivers around beverage decision-making. And this is really, as it says on the slide, this is our gauge of the job, the psychological job that a beverage category or brand does. And so you go from left to right. Function, that's all about practical options that make rational sense. Often that's why people think they do things. We think we make purely rational decisions, and yet we all know that's not the case. So these others around experiences, sensory discoveries in the purple, or conformity, social connection, and agreement can be a really strong driver. And last but not least, what we call impulse, the most subconscious, all about this feeling good, quickly. And we're going to talk about what we've seen in the overall beverage landscape and within sports and energy specifically. And I'm going to go fairly quickly. As you said, this report's available. I'll put the link in the chat in a moment, where people can download the original Beverage 50 along with this report. But as you know, and as we talked about this and said, well, what else should we look at? What else is really interesting? You provided some great context on this first point, that sports and energy, the lines are blurring. There's some confusion from a category management standpoint, from a positioning standpoint. There's been lots of news in both categories about brands declining, brands, acquisitions, all sorts of things. So how can we resolve the murkiness? Looking from a very consumer-centric space, what's going on here? And why? Why are some brands doing better than others? And so we dug into these data to answer that. Interestingly, when you look at sports and energy, they're among the most functional in beverage. I mean, they have stuff in them. They're made to do things. And yet, at the highest level, what we find is that both categories, consumer decisions are driven by what we'd call impulse, not function. So this, I showed that map a moment ago, and for anybody on the call that isn't specifically looking after sports and energy, we can look at these other categories. And in fact, we've had a lot of inquiries since we released the support a couple of weeks back about, well, can you show me, X, Y, or Z? And we're preparing deeper dives, and we can dive deeper into any of these. But for today, we're looking over here on the right. And what's interesting about it is you see that both sports and energy drinks sit in the same, what we call neighborhood. They're both driven by this feel good, what we call impulse, feel good now. And as you can see, kind of in contrast, they're not over in the functional neighborhood, which on its face is pretty interesting. It's not like, hey, this makes rational, practical sense. I can imagine sitting someone down and they'd say, well, I drink sports drinks because they provide, vitamins and electrolytes or whatever they have. This is our first, aha that says they're the same psychologically in a consumer's mind. And that really at the core is what's driving so much confusion in the category. This one's kind of an eye chart, but these are the brands that were included in the Bev50. So what you have here is the overall rank in the Bev50, the original report. You see Gatorade was number one, on down. And this is a mix, obviously, of sports and energy drinks. But across these, what that previous chart is telling us is that these brands are driven by this feel-good impulse, not so much things like functional hydration. They're focused on the individual, all about individual experiences, less on group conformity. They're all about providing a win, all about providing very quick feels, emotionally driven benefits and experience, not so much scientific efficacy. So we dig in a little bit here now into sports drinks, then we go into energy, and then I'll finish with some comments on the white space that we're seeing. And I said I'm going to move quick. I'm sure I'm moving too quick in some cases, but if anybody's got questions, drop them in the Q&A. If we don't get to them here, we'll circle back. And certainly, I know Dwayne or I are happy to talk about this after this webinar too. So Gatorade, as I said, it's the number one on the Bev50 and the strongest performer in the space. I mean, it's the category captain. It makes sense. But what you have here is an index of how strongly consumers feel that a brand aligns with that red, that impulse. And you see over on the left, the category, that's a 134. That's the core job of the sports category. Help me feel good now. Gatorade's pretty close behind, and you see Prime and other players arraying out in terms of how strongly consumers perceive this. This is the perception is reality here. We're not putting our own judgment or assessment on this. We have a technique within the measure we use to say, what do people think? And this is how they align the brands with the category. So here it is in a more visual array, similar to what I just showed you. You can see that the category is way over here in the impulse. Gatorade, Prime, Powerade kind of array back. Electrolyte does show up over here, but you can see it's more strongly. So notably, Electrolyte and Powerade, people perceive them to be more functional, to like make good sense. And when we look at their activation, this psychology is interesting and it can feel very amorphous, but it tells us a lot about how to show up in market. And so just kind of looking at, website stuff, just kind of general high level, there's some interesting things that, it's obvious Gatorade is doing to fuel this, the highly visual, using imagery over words, even the positioning of it's not a sports drink, it's fuel, much more evocative. Some of the things that get more into the weeds, a lot of shadows, reds, oranges, believe it or not, color and heuristics and design make heuristics is this scientific word for how people make, quick subconscious decisions. They're using a lot of those levers to provide that. So you look at kind of the way Gatorade's showing up, at least, just in digital, versus like I showed that Powerade is over in the more functional space. They're not pushing that as strongly. And again, this is like one artifact, so not to indict the Powerade strategy, but they're using more statistical, more structure function, more words and imagery, even believe it or not, the blue it matters, focused on what's in it versus what it does. You can see clearly now with 50% more electrolytes with an asterisk. I mean, it's a very rational, at least in this execution, a very rational put up. And it appears that that's what, consumers are taking away from the brand. And it's not to say it's the wrong strategy, and I'll get more into it, but it's misaligned with what's driving the core category. And typically bigger established brands, you typically want to more directly align with the category driver. And again, I'll talk more about that. Prime is one that's kind of a head scratcher for everybody. It's interesting looking at their communication. They kind of have both. And again, just looking at their website, they, on the left side, they do use some rational argument, but I think that what's happening is they're getting more credit for, the right side of this page, just due to the personality, the social media origins of the brand. They're getting a lot of credit for driving that impulse space. So they're really strongly aligning with it. And as we know, in most cases, making inroads as a result. I'm not going to read this one to you. It is in the report. On the left, you have the brands. Across, you have some demographic call outs. I think one thing I will point out is over on this far right column, Hispanic consumers. There's some interesting things. One notably, you look at electrolyte, it actually drops 12 points with Hispanics. And we've done some interesting reports lately on like LATAM origin companies. And what's interesting about that is Electrolyte is a Mexican brand that has somewhat recently come to the US. It's been in the news lately, obviously. But it's its origins as a Mexican brand, that's not driving it. In this case, the fact that it drops, fairly dramatically with Hispanic consumers shows the importance of the positioning and the psychology versus something like demographics. So these are in here and certainly can dig deeper down the road. Okay, shifting over to energy drink brands, which, as we know, consumers are sort of conflating the two, and hopefully this is helping reveal why. Now we look at energy. Some of what we call the OG energy drinks, sort of like with sports drinks, are aligned with this left side. So the category is this really strong index on feel good now. Not about, this is good for all of us to enjoy together, not functional. This is a quick boost, when I need it. Not all about sensory, new flavors, new experiences. For the most part, Red Bull, Monster are really strongly aligned with that. And I think in this one, even in more contrast to what we saw in the sports, some of the newer entrants, Celsius, I know Bang's not newer, but they've sort of been in transformation, and Alani Nu are less aligned with it. And there's some interesting things going on with that. So you see here, everybody's, and this one's, I think, probably a little bit less surprising that in energy, they're all over in this, feel good, quick win. However, Alani Nu, some of the interesting ones that have been being talked about, Celsius and Alani Nu specifically, are in very different neighborhoods. They're approaching this category very differently. Whether they recognize it or not, this is what consumers are seeing for them. And I would just point out that for Celsius, you see over in the function, it's all about rational options. Look at the under index of the energy category. So it's really interesting that it's like, not only is energy over in this impulse space, it's decidedly not in this functional or even this real experiential sensory space. And yet these brands are over there. So it's something that we look at to understand, well, are these brands misaligned and making a mistake, or have they actually found white space and opportunity? And I'll comment on that. Red Bull and Monster, this is not terribly difficult to imagine it. You think back to the slide I showed on Gatorade, highly visual, lots of drama and contrast, lots of imagery around winning and competition. All of those are sort of the cornerstones of that impulse neighborhood. And again, you see some, I don't think there's anything dramatically, and this is such an eye chart. I know it's hard to look at, but if you take your time and look at maybe things in your own data, it can help clarify. There's just some interesting things happening with demographics. I mean, again, Hispanic is interesting that many of the brands drop. And the reason I note that is because a lot of our clients are looking at Hispanic as the fastest growing ethnicity. A lot of brands are focused on younger multicultural consumers. And so it's just interesting that in both of these categories, a lot of these brands do drop with certain demographics, including Hispanic, and in some cases others are performing. Okay, so newer entrants, and I talked about this, and for a lot of bigger beverage companies, acquisition targets or for the PE kind of realm, potential investment targets. As I said, they're aligning with new benefits in the category. So Prime is one of these interesting ones that it's in both spaces, and they are making functional claims. I mean, they are making some, you look at this, okay, yes, you have, the usual suspects of the social media stars on the left, but they're making a very rational appeal, 200 milligrams, zero sugar, 300 milligrams, et cetera. They're getting credit for the feel good now, the impulsive piece of it. And that's a big piece of why they're doing well. Celsius is a really interesting one. I mean, they are going there. You look at a slide like this, there is no surprise that they're being perceived over in that very functional space. Lots of text, fewer images, all about effectiveness, scientific, free from some of the things, frankly, that brands get in trouble with when they listen too closely to consumers. They get too much into the rational. Celsius is going hard after it, and it appears they may be onto something, at least in the near term. Alani Nu is interesting because looking at this slide, it's no surprise why they're in that purple, that experiential, all about sensory experiences. They talk about bright, bold flavors, words like that. I mean, that's bright. That's a very sensorial way of talking about the space. Even their latest flavor, Hawaiian shaved ice. It's very interesting the way they're thinking about flavor and the way they're showing up in this case, like in social media, is not that hard impulse space we've been talking about. It's not the functional space. It's all about exploration. So again, they've carved out a unique space. Bang is, whether they realize it or not, they're actually playing into that space too. I showed the alignment there. This looks, if you kind of step back, it kind of looks a lot like Alani Nu. That brand is being kind of moved into that space. And I mean, look at the radical skedaddle, like that's the flavor. I mean, that's not a functional, that's not a high like alpha impulse flavor either. They're moving into this space, that experiential space as well. So last but not least, and then we're going to open it up to questions, where's the white space? Like, so what? What should we be doing? And so as we step back from this, you've seen this slide. Everybody, there's the reason that these brands are conflating trading volume, confusing to shelve and merchandise, et cetera, is because, deep in our subconscious brains, they're doing the same thing. They are fueling that, feel good now. So you can imagine if somebody walks into a C store or whatever, their brain, their reptilian brain is going, what's going to make me feel good now? That's their decision criteria. And because both sports drinks and energy drinks are perceived to be doing that, there's a lot of overlap. The brain, the subconscious brain is going, these are the same thing, pick from across this set. So when we look at, the brands, it's true across both energy and sports drinks, which we've shown. And as we dig into the data a little bit deeper, and this is where, it's probably warrants if somebody's really interested, a follow-up discussion that we're happy to have. Bigger established energy brands should focus on benefits beyond the category. So if you're like Red Bull and Monster, looking out here, if you were a big brand, evaluating an investment or an acquisition or something like that, that's where we see opportunity into these other spaces. So, thinking about these new benefit areas, that's a space that appears incremental. And then with that, you look at some examples, things like concentrates, powders, new forms are a good example of that. Gatorade's kind of made a lot of noise about, concentrates and powders and things. And it's easy to get caught up in the discussion and say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. We don't want to ship water. It's easier to merchandise. There's a lot of efficiencies. But when you step back and look at it from a consumer perspective, something like a concentrate or a powder actually moves into this experiential space. In particular. And so you look at Gatorade pods over here, everybody talks about the pods, but look at what's going on here. There's an app with it, and it's actually all about personalization. So instead of now, it'd be very easy to say, hey, pods are great. They fit in your bag. You can take them anywhere. They're very, they make a lot of sense from the functional perspective. But Gatorade's doing some interesting things, saying it lets you customize it, lets you personalize it, make a new sensory experience. Not that they're doing all of this, but mix flavors, mix ingredients. That's very much over in that experience space. So I think it's a cool example that's going on out in the world, that from a consumer standpoint, there's probably a very different reason that it would be successful than what the organization or a marketing organization might initially perceive. For up and coming brands, being different, and Alani Nu and Celsius are good examples of this. Being different drives momentum. So standing out from the category, those things, as I said, are doing very different things. However, you see those under indexes for energy in this case on experience and function. What we see in our data is that as those brands grow and become bigger and more established, typically they need to move closer to the core category. So as Alani Nu and Celsius continues to grow, and a lot of brands hit this sort of plateau, a lot of times the reason for that is that in fact they're sticking to their origins, which would make sense on its face. But what can happen behind the scenes is they're failing to eventually assimilate to the larger category driver, where the bigger volume and the bigger competition is. So if you're Alani Nu, it's like, what you're doing for the most part seems to be making sense. At some point, you probably have to step into that more competitive category space in order to really establish yourself as a mainstream mature brand. And then last but not least, the social, this conformity in the social space is interesting. It's antithetical, and I haven't talked about it once until now. It hasn't come up at all. It's just sort of a total neutral for the category. And if you recall at the top of my comments, I said, energy and sports are all about me. What's in it for me? It's not us. However, there are some interesting, examples out there and some opportunity. There's a total white space to explore. I'm not recommending it, but I'm saying it's there to look at. And so things like, social consumption, brand equity, endorsement, you see this G Fuel that its origin is really around gaming, in a gamer community. And that's a very conformity driven, all about this is what we enjoy. And G Fuel is an interesting brand. They've got a million different formats in beverage and beyond. I think they're spreading themselves a little thin with that, but it's an interesting opportunity to look at. And again, if somebody was saying, well, what else is out there? This is pretty wide open for exploration to see if it's something that can hunt. Okay, so I know I flew through that. I said I was gonna. Happy to talk through this now, and to follow. There's our email address down below. I'm going to go back to the chat and put the link to download these reports in there, so you can go back and look more closely. But Dwayne, I think from there we can probably open it up to. I'd love to hear your thoughts and any questions.
Yeah, and please, everyone, if you have any questions for Hunter, do drop them in the Q&A there, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Hunter, one of the things I'm wondering immediately is, do companies actually drive these consumer perceptions that you're talking about? Or should those consumer perceptions, however they're formed in those consumers' minds, somehow drive the companies in terms of how they position and market their products?
Yeah, I mean, to me, we want to have agency as marketers over this. And this is absolutely something that can be controlled. So, I'll pick on Powerade a little bit. I use the example where they're pushing very hard on 50% more electrolytes, very functional. If that brand were having, headwinds, there's absolutely opportunity for them to move over into that more impulse category space. And there's ways to do it without just aping Gatorade. Without just saying, well, they call it fuel. Okay, we'll call it fuel. But what it comes to is understanding the mindset, the psychology, ultimately the decision criteria that people are using. And so, I mean, to me, the answer is always, we're marketing organizations. We should be controlling the narrative. Now, the challenge is, and where our remit out in the world is to help guide how to do that. That's easier said than done. In some cases, brands are accidentally, kind of falling victim, or in some cases, accidentally succeeding. That can be equally unsatisfying. So it's all about understanding the whys behind it, and then controlling that narrative. Being deliberate in what you're standing for and how you're showing up out in the market.
We have a question in the Q&A, which I think is a really good question. Why is electrolyte losing Hispanic share? I think it's important to point out what you were showing is sort of consumer perception by Hispanics. Explain that a little bit versus, losing market share, for instance, of Hispanics, and what you're seeing there. Let's dive into that a little bit more, because that Hispanic market is like huge and important, and companies are really smart. Companies are paying attention to that.
Absolutely.
It's a diverse group as well. So there's a lot of reasons to pay close attention to it, but take us into that just a little bit.
Yeah, I did. I did a talk at LATAM Food Week, which was something that the Food Institute, who I know you worked with, Dwayne, was putting on. And basically, there's just been a lot of assumption that a Hispanic origin brand, so a Mexican brand, will have this natural uptake with a Hispanic, whether Mexican or otherwise. Specifically, though, Mexican expats in the U.S. would have a natural uptake to it. And I think that's something that's easy for marketers to sort of assume. What's interesting to me is what these data say, and I'll put a huge asterisk on it. The electrolyte team certainly deserves the right to weigh in and discuss on this. But what our data are saying is that the reason they're not doing well with Hispanics specifically, in spite of maybe the assumption they would, is that they're not aligning to that category benefit. They're not providing the quick feel good. And so what that says is that, look, if I'm a Mexican American, I'm driven by want to feel good now just as much as any other demographic. That's what's driving my brand choice. I don't care if it's Gatorade or electrolyte, the origin, things like that are less important. So I think there's that interesting sort of subtext to it relative to Hispanics specifically. But to the question, what these data say is the reason it's not performing as well, inclusive of Hispanics, at least, based on their perception of the brand, is that it's what it is. It's functional. It's not what it does, the feels, what it's going to make and do for me. And so as the brand grows, I know there's been a big shift in their ownership and things. That's something they need to look really hard at is, do we want to stay in this functional space and try to own it? Celsius has actually been doing okay there. But there's some different structure between those businesses and those brands. Electrolyte needs to look at those other three neighborhoods, specifically that impulse one, and see where their kind of forever home, or at least their growth opportunity is.
So moving over to Prime for just a minute, Prime Sports, and now they've got an energy version as well. Does your research help us to understand why this influencer brand, it's very much an influencer brand, how it's been able to basically buck the time scale that it takes to reach the kind of sales levels they have? Does it help explain somehow how they're able to just surprise everyone and grab the market share that they have so far?
Yeah, I think there's that, look, they have an interesting voice that social media has provided that was never possible, in the olden days. Couple interesting things. What it says is that why people are following that is not because they want to assimilate to that tribe, that social group. They see something of themselves in it. They're like, yeah, that's like me, that fighting, sort of, rogue mindset, people are seeing themselves in that. So it's almost like it's not that it was an influencer, it's that it's an influencer who they really aspire to personally, not just he drinks this, so I want to drink this. It's not that kind of tribal thing. It's he represents something that I want to believe and apply about myself. And this question about dark energy, a brand that sounds like like kind of liquid death, that's a cool example. And yes, it fits in that impulse space, that danger, kind of rebellious. I mean, think about that when liquid death water came out. It's like somebody said, well, what's the opposite? What's the worst kind of water you could ever provide? That's the functional brain talking. No, water's not liquid death. Water's liquid life. But you think about that impulse, feel good, there's different, as I said, all roads to that impulse is not the same. There's different expressions of that. Liquid death is one we've talked about, and it sounds like this dark energy is a good example of that.
And do you think when it comes to liquid death, one of the things they tried to do too is say, let's market it like beer. Let's give it all the characteristics of beer, but it's a non-alcoholic, it's a water. How does that factor into these consumer insights that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of Bev Alc brands are in that blow off steam space. Now, that's not exclusive. We do a lot of Bev Alc work too. That's not, all roads don't lead to that, but that certainly is a space where a lot of brands have, you look at like Modelo, and I commented this in my presentation the other day. Modelo is not succeeding because it's a Mexican brand. Modelo's succeeding because, look, Bud Light clearly had its issues, but shouldn't Coors Light and Miller Lite now be the number one beer? Like, if it's just, light lager. Modelo really talked into that fighting spirit, and that is very much in that impulse, competitive, winning kind of space. So that's a great example of one that's been their execution of how to get into that space, and clearly that drives that category in the broadest sense, and it's very similar in that way psychologically to what we've discussed today.
There's a couple other interesting questions. Someone wants to know about whether you have any information on the Caribbean and Latin American market. I mean, I guess the question there is, do you think results will be different if you went to an entirely different market from the U.S.? Would the approach be the same? But I mean, what sort of things might you expect in terms of differences, or would this basically cut across all of that?
So this is all U.S. data. I should have said that at the top of it. I was kind of moving quickly. This is from our U.S. database. We do a lot of global work, but it's impossible to create a global database, that we'd have representatives. So nothing in here was Caribbean or Latin American. In our data, we'd probably be able to comment more on Latin American than Caribbean specifically. But these are human truths. So these are measurable and true across cultures. What you'll find is that the U.S., true to the melting pot, meme, is a pretty representative culture, meaning it's got a lot of diversity of psychology. For example, when we look at like South Korea, that whole culture will tend one way. So you will see that like a more established culture, more singular culture will kind of pull all of this one way. And in like South Korea, it's that more conformity. What do we think? What's in it for us? Whereas like in Brazil, believe it or not, we see that actually the rational kind of pulls along. The theory would be it's much more sensory and experiential, but culturally Brazil pulls more rational. So we'll see that in our global work, and you have to look at it case by case. But generally, these truths, at least with sort of a 30,000 foot, should hold true as long as the cultural context relative to the category isn't like dramatically different than the US.
The Bev50 looked at 50 brands, basically. I don't think you went into anything deep on Gatorade Light or G-Fit, some of the new products, but do you have any general thoughts about the functional side of those? I mean, those are very much offshoots of Gatorade that are offering specific functionality, like being less sugar, G-Fit, kind of a light workout water, et cetera. Just any general thoughts there?
We didn't study those specifically. We certainly can and do that all the time where you drill down. But what you find with huge brands, so like toothpaste is a good example. What you'll find is there's all four of those mindsets in a category. So what Gatorade's probably discovered is that, look, core Gatorade's over in this area. there are consumers that drink it for a more functional reason that's over here, and innovation. When you get into innovation discussions, that's how you can be more complementary. And I made that comment that, like, if I'm Gatorade, you got to look a feel. You can't just be more impulsive. You're just going to cannibalize. But if, for example, G-Fit or the pods, any of those propositions are in that more experiential, sensory, make it my own, discover new things, that's highly incremental and advisable. And so, when brands are able to be that disciplined about it, that's the smartest approach. Alani Nu can't do that yet. They're not ready. They're not big enough. They don't have to do that yet to find growth. So, and that's where I said kind of at the end, it depends on your level of maturity as a brand, how far you should push into other places.
Let's go a little longer, if you don't mind. We're getting, several questions here. I'd like to try to get to them.
Sure.
Someone wants to know, why is Celsius declining in its Bev rank with women?
Yeah. And again, I'd have to caveat that, but what I've seen be, a mistake is that, and if you recall that slide I showed you, they're going pretty hard at women, at least based on, the social media, like, this makes good sense. It's that kind of like almost Lululemon, like, affect, but with this really, like, this isn't a girl's energy drink. This is for, like, high performance, very functional space. And, what the hypothesis would be that the reason, that it's declining its rank is because broadly that women, that's not what they're looking to the category for, that they're looking to the category for, a different benefit, potentially that impulse feel good now, which again, you look at Prime, can feel really male. And so that's one of my favorite things when we discover it, when it happens, is it's like, women make sense and males are over on this feel good space. Not the case. We see in context that something that's easy culturally to sort of misconstrue, that everybody wants this, the Prime, like alpha male space. Not true. For women, you probably show up differently, but it very well, and what these data say is that women, men, everybody are over in that feel good now space. And because Celsius is in the really rational space, it's creating, some challenges perceptually.
So if they're actually, if their market is moving, is kind of 50-50, unlike, sports drinks traditionally, how do you explain the fact that they picked up more women?
Yeah.
So they say, but we still find this sort of disparity.
It's creating an incremental benefit. So it is something that in the world, what happens a lot of times, especially we see in beverages, novelty has a high impact. So it clearly came out of the gate and was something very different from that, that impulse space. And that can drive, looking at it, it drops 6 points in the ranking and rises 2 points. Celsius does, and rises 2 points in the ranking. Interestingly, it drops 10 points with Gen Z and drops nine places with younger millennials. So it's not like it's like plummeting. In our snack work, there was a brand that we saw a sort of antithetical to Electrolit. The highest jumping brand with Gen Z was Takis, the Mexican really high like flavor snack. It moved 28 points in the 50 ranking for snacks with Gen Z. That's a big jump. Like, that's a meaningful jump. These aren't like, 6 points, 2 points are not damning. But what it would say is that Celsius, as it grows and sits in this kind of middle, it's ascended to kind of the middle. It's in a sort of vulnerable and sort of seminal space where it needs to at least be aware of this, because it very well may be that what got you here won't get you there. That rational appeal probably needs to be augmented, or at least considered with everybody, inclusive of women, to continue to ascend and grow up into the really established space.
You may think you're talking to a demographic group in the right way. You may have gotten their attention, but are you really communicating with them long term in a way that's going to continue to add sales, basically?
Yep. Go ahead, Dwayne.
No, please.
No. I can get going. I'd go all day. Let's see if we can get some questions.
So let's see. Someone wants to know, if we push on the function and experience side, is brick and mortar exhibition investment still relevant, or is that more for an impulse approach brand? I guess buying shelf space, basically.
Yeah, I mean, when somebody's in that impulse mindset, they're using what we call ambient attention, and they're just letting the things jump off the shelf to them. So point of purchase is really important. When someone's in the functional space, they use more mission attention. They go, I'm going to go get, Celsius brand energy drink, and their attention becomes more focused. So the general answer to that is, yeah, that shelf is going to matter. That's where the brand decision is going to be made. And you want it, and it's a noisy set. So it's interesting. You look at it like something like Monster Pure Zero, or whatever they call the zero, it's white. They're creating a lot of contrast by not shouting for attention. So there's different moves you have to make. It's absolutely important, but I would not overlook digital. If you remember that this is all about helping you feel good fast, there's some really cool digital programmatic stuff you could do, no pun intended, to prime the shopper and advantage yourself when they do actually end up going, whether ordering, via brick and or e-com, or actually, shopping via brick and mortar.
Someone wants to know about Body Armor. The sales momentum has slowed since they were fully acquired by Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. They want to know the why behind the growth slowdown, and of course, there's a number of reasons for that, including the competition with Gatorade and supply chain, et cetera. But I'm not. Do you have any thoughts about Body Armor just based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that Body Armor is, again, from a consumer perception, living in that red neighborhood, that feel good fast neighborhood, and it's just not delivering it as strongly as Gatorade, a very literal competitor. So I know I don't have my slides up, but the sports category was a 134 index on that feel good now. Gatorade's a 118 index, Body Armor's a 104. So it's almost down at like sort of, category anti-level 100 index. It's just doing that job a lot less than Gatorade is. And of course, we can look at this over time. There's a lot of things they can do about that. But from the pure data perspective, and Dwayne, your point's well made. Beverage is so crazy with distribution and all that stuff. But from a consumer psychology perspective, that's why.
So besides branding and messaging, this is a question. Besides branding and messaging, does the fact that sports and energy skews to impulse over function simply reflect the fact that a bunch of the sports and energy consumers are consuming for lifestyle choice rather than athletic benefit?
It certainly says that benefit far transcends athletic. I think we've all known that for a long time. But feel good now, we all know a good amount of the Gatorade or any energy drink or sports isotonic volume is not athletes, in an athletic situation. So what it says is they're drinking it to feel better now. And there's a lot of contexts in which that happens beyond, sport. So yeah, that it certainly speaks to the breadth of the benefits and the reason they're drinking it. If I understood the question correctly, versus the more functional, when I need this, I drink this in order to get this. It's a much less rational decision process.
Another question, do we see product price point being a factor when it comes to consumers making decisions in the impulse mindset?
Yes, we have seen a lot. We've been tracking price stuff for the last few years because everybody's freaking out about it, obviously.
You've done a lot of work in this, yeah.
And we talked about this at Future Smarts, in fact. Everybody said, the youngest, lowest income households, Gen Z multicultural are going to be the first to stop drinking soda or stop, buying premium things. The opposite has happened. Because when somebody just wants to feel better now, their calculus, their equation in their brain is not what's the best price per ounce on an isotonic beverage. It's what's going to help me feel good right now. That mindset is like a toddler in the mall. It's like, I want this, I want that, I want this. It's irrational, and it's not self-destructively irrational, but it's not making these concerted, creating a spreadsheet and putting everything side by side. So brands and categories that are over in that impulse space have fared really well the last couple of years. Salty snacks being a macro example, along with CSDs, because they're doing that. It's like I've made this, this comparison. It's like, look, they're not looking for a drink; they're looking for a 3-minute, vacation. They're looking for a break. So It's an important way to think about that. And the psychology that comes with that driver is not a price value mindset 9 times out of 10.
So let's take one more question. How much can brands established as impulse, like C4, stretch into white spaces? And this person specifically wants to know what guardrails do they need to consider? And, for instance, if you stretch C4 into all day energy, that might not work, they suggest.
Yeah. They can go anywhere they want. It's a matter of marketing. We have full control over this. And frankly, to me, what's so gratifying about these data is it connects all the way down. You go, okay, so how should we position? What should our communications be? When and where should we be communicating with people? That becomes much more of a science than an art, although there's obviously both involved. So the answer is you can go anywhere you want. It's a matter of, you can't do what I call the Band-Aid rip. You can't, one day we stand for this, tomorrow we stand for that, because your credibility is not going to be there. But as long as you think about either innovation, so saying, C4 all day, and it's incremental, it's something you say, look, this is different than the base, or a migration. I think marketers are always surprised. I always hear marketers say, where will consumers let us go? And it's like that you can make snow tires if you want to. It's just a matter of, it's probably not A, strategically wise, and B, you've got to think of a strategic process to bring people along. But you can go, and there's countless examples of brands that have dramatically shifted from their origins into a different space. That's certainly the case here.
I lied. One last question. I love this question. I got to ask you. This person wants to know, when it comes to impulse and experiential brands, is there a difference in whether people buy, 12 and 24 packs versus single serve, for instance, based on those kind of factors?
Now, I don't have the data. I'd have to go to Numerator and say, what. Now, we've done that before, so that's something that you can overlay, like Numerator, for example, and say, hey, of your multi-pack users, what's their psychology versus your single pack, the individual or immediate consumption. The impulse mindset more directly, is more directly served by immediate consumption, single. C-store type things. I mean, the C-store is like Impulse City. It makes total sense. However, that's not to say that multi-packs is not relevant, because what that shopper is trying to do is go, and what you want to really instill with them. This is a good example of where your digital programs could do this. It's sort of like, buy this and you'll feel good anytime you need it. So their brain is compelling them what's going to feel good right now. Like, I want to take one out of here and drink it in the store. But it's not to say that a multi-pack and the proposition of, a feel good, 12 ounces of feel good anytime you need it. And so you're planning ahead with more of a multi-pack type purchase. That's not off the table. It's not that this mindset goes through Kroger. People shop with this mindset all the time. It's not just, Casey's and Circle K and like the super high impulse spaces. So it's a really good question. And it gives at least some framing on how to frame a multi-pack and what's going through their brain as they're deciding, those critical little yards and inches at a shelf, what's going to get the nod versus what isn't.
Well, I'm sure people on this call are going to be knocking on your door trying to get deeper on some of this stuff. It's been really fantastic. I appreciate you sharing all that with us. And Hunter Thurman, Alpha Diver, thank you so much. And we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks, Dwayne.